It's the 1980s. Millions of viewers are tuning into Top of the Pops each week. And indeed, pop was back, with all its fantasy, image and glamour. Anarchy has been crushed, and the major record labels are back in town, with video as their weapon of choice. Creating stars overnight, there's money to be made by the chosen few. This is a story of creativity, power and intrigue, set within the hallowed halls of 80s pop. Sade and Paul Anthony Cook, Just a Drummer, Part 1. The debut Sade album, Diamond Life, is now 40 years old. Having sold 10 million copies worldwide, it became one of the top-selling albums of its era. And with the TikTok generation, tracks like Smooth Operator are now reaching a new audience. When a band has worked together for years and they suddenly hit the big time, some members of that band get left behind. Sometimes for good reason, and sometimes it's a little more interesting.
It'd be better if you just tell everybody that you've left the band, your own accord, and obviously it's going to look better for you if you don't say you've been sacked. It was very derogatory, his terms in the letter, which annoyed me, which actually really pissed me off actually at the time. So at least it clarified where I was. I was neither a session drummer or the original drummer. I was actually gone at that point.
Paul Anthony Cook is the former drummer with the band Sade, and has been on a long search for the truth about why he was ousted from the band, his drumming skills derided, and how he appeared to be hung out to dry by his former bandmates after a 1997 legal action. On his 40-year journey, Paul has set out to try and restore his reputation, reveal misinformation, and get paid what he is due. And now it's my turn to play a detective and work through his story to see what happened. I'm Douglas Pye, and this is the story of Paul Anthony Cook, who got treated as just a drummer. But first, let me introduce the band and its supporting acts. In the band Sade, we have on vocals Sade Adu. On guitar and sax, we have Stuart Matthewman. On bass, we have Paul Denman. On keyboards, we have Andrew Hale. And on drums, we did have Paul Cook. And let's not forget the supporting acts, and in no particular order, we have Ray St. John on guitar and lead writer with the band Pride. And as former manager of the band Sade, we have Lee Barrett. As the producer of the album Diamond Life, we have Robin Miller. As solicitor to Sade, we have Brian Carr. And last, but by no means least, we have Jack Stephen, former A&R at RCA. And as for any other characters and famous faces not mentioned, we'll meet them as our story progresses. My part in this story dates back to 1987. I lived in a bedsit in North Villas in Camden, London. My rent was £23 a week. I had a 10p electricity meter, and we had a communal payphone in the hallway. It's here I met a guy who'd moved in upstairs, called Paul Cook. As you might have guessed, North Villas was not then the seriously expensive road of £1 million houses and flats. Anyway, one evening we got chatting in the Lord Stanley. This was the local pub opposite the bedsits. It was then a traditional old-style pub with swirly carpets, thick curtains and the usual tobacco-stained ceiling. And, as you do, we asked each other what we did, and he said he used to be in the band Sade. Well, this was very impressive and a far cry from the down-at-heel surroundings we lived in, and even further than the pub we were drinking in. I questioned what had happened, as Sade's Diamond Life album had been massive, with, I presume, accompanying massive payouts. He said he'd founded the band and had worked and contributed to the original songs for the album, but had been sacked by Sade just before the album hit the big time, with no money given, and hence chatting to me. I didn't really get an answer as to why he'd been sacked, and at the time thought best not to pursue it. It seemed a bit of a sore subject, especially as the rest of the band had made a vast amount of money from the success of the album. I thought, he's a good bloke, and we became friends. We remained friends over the next couple of years, and we even went off to Berlin for a week in August of '88. This obviously was before the Berlin Wall came down, which made it very interesting, but that's another story. I then went off to college, and Paul suddenly disappeared back up north, and we lost contact with each other. Nearly 35 years passed by, as it does, and he decided to send me a message on social media, having found an old Berlin photo of him and me at his mum's. And times have changed somewhat. We now have emails, social media, multi-channel TV, downloadable music, and the mobile phone. And so finally, I get to ask what actually happened to Paul and his part in the band Sade. The highs and lows of being in a band that was the next big thing. And this is not just a story about Paul, but about the music industry as it was 40 years ago, and perhaps in many respects as it still is today. Firstly, to be clear, this Paul Cook is not the Sex Pistols drummer, and indeed, to save confusion, Paul Cook was renamed Paul Anthony Cook, with an E. This, I believe, was suggested by Sade. The Sex Pistols were so last year, and yuppies were in. And after all these years, I'm here at King's Cross Station about to hop on a train to Hull to catch up with Paul. Paul was brought up in Hull and moved back in 1990, and has since got married, had 3 children, worked on various music projects, become a teacher and taught music and media, and has also worked as a gardener.
You're right.
Yeah, good. How's things?
All right.
Yeah, good. Are you still recording?
I'm still recording, yeah.
I'm on the move. For a long time no see.
I know, what's it?
You've tracked me down.
Yeah.
After
What?
35
years.
And we're now heading back to Paul's house with a little diversion down a place called Mayfield Street, and back to 1979, where, in this area of northeast England, our story of the band Sade begins. Mayfield Street is a quiet residential street. It's made up of Victorian terraced houses, and it's down this street there was a band rehearsal room and recording studio. And also to note, around the corner was, and still is, a music pub called the Polar Bear.
And we're now down in Mayfield Street, which I believe there's a studio here. Is this where it was?
Yeah, this is it. That gate was the entrance there. So you used to go through the little door and then into the back into the rehearsal studios. This is where we rehearsed in my first band, The Posers, and this area was the heart of the whole music scene, along with the Polar Bear, which was the meeting place for musicians at the time. And nothing's changed really. The door's there, the entrance is there, but is it still a rehearsal studio?
You mentioned the Posers. When and how did the Posers start life?
Yeah, it was in the summer of '79, and I saw an advert for a drummer in the Hull Daily Mail. So I called the number and spoke to Paul Denman, who was the bass player evidently, and also the lead singer of the band, which was called The Posers. So I went for an audition to this very spot down Mayfield Street and got the job. We were both originally from East Hull. It panned out, which gave us a connection to that area. We were also both working class lads at the time. I was a welder and Paul Denman was a coppersmith. So we connected not only with the music, but also where we were from, what we did, and I was curious to meet him at the time.
What were some of the local bands at the time?
Yeah, there was a lot of new wave punk bands, Niam, and one that stands out for me is Lord Mountbatten's Bits and Pieces, a very controversial name for a punk band at the time, but you know, it was anarchic and it was, from what I remember, it was a good band.
And Roland Gift, I hear.
Yeah, Roland Gift was in the Acrylics. He was a sax player. The Acrylics was a kind of ska band. They needed, Roland in there on his sax. He was a very good part of the frontline team. And then he went on to get a job with Fine Young Cannibals as their frontman.
What do you remember of the gigs you did around this area and around Hull?
Yeah, the main venue was Spring Street Theatre, which is now the Hull Truck Theatre. But the Spring Street Theatre was the main venue for bands at the time to be seen at, so we all aimed for that venue. But the gigs I remember were the ones out of town with Holly and the Italians at the Grimsby Institute, and we played Boston with the Acrylics. It was the days of punk, so when we were played with Holly and the Italians, we were covered in spit throughout the set. But and I think Alan had a go at somebody with his guitar, but that was all part of the course in '79.
I've heard some of the tracks from the Posers, and I think they're really good, those tracks. What was the reaction, apart from being spat on, maybe?
Generally good. I mean, we were generally in that theme of things with music at that time. But yeah, the music was of that time. And I think the ones you heard were recorded in a little studio down Mayfield Street, which we're just stood outside of now. I think around about, 26 was maybe the house that the studio was in. It was just somebody's home studio that the band turned up to and recorded in. But that studio used to record a lot of local bands, and obviously the rehearsal studios was just down the street.
And so it's from Hull Station where Paul Cook and Paul Denman get on the long train to London with their band, The Posers. It's now autumn 1980. And we're now here at Paul's house, ready to record. Firstly, to pick up on the Posers, what happened when you arrived in London?
Well, we basically had 6 months with no gigs, and while Paul Denman and Alan Beadle tried to write new music, nothing materialised. We had no gigs planned, the songs didn't pan out, nothing came together really, and then Paul and Alan brought a drum machine, which I was opposed to, and I kind of parted company with them at that point.
But why get a drum machine if they've already got you as their drummer?
Well, this is where the music industry changed and the way of making music changed. I mean, you could buy a drum machine and a Tascam 4-track recorder and basically create music in your bedsit. At that time, we're talking about 1980. You could be a one-man band and no need to pay out for an expensive studio to record things like drums. This was not how I imagined it all going. But basically, we did nothing in the Posers, and after a year, Paul Denman and Alan were all set to head back home to Hull, and Paul Denman back to his factory job at BAE.
You, on the other hand, had a 9-to-5 job, so you were already established in London. Now, this takes us up to early 1981. And I believe you then met up with Stuart Matthewman, who had recently arrived in London. Although there was a whole connection between your parents, I believe you and Stuart hadn't actually met before?
No, we hadn't actually met before. Stuart had been in a band called The Odds and had probably seen the Posers play. He knew of me and Paul, no doubt. But as far as I was aware, he wanted to be a sax player in a jazz funk band and had come down to London to try his luck. So I got his number through my father and gave him a call, and he said to me he was auditioning for a band and that they might need a drummer. So I first met up with Stuart in his bedsit in Earls Court with his friend from Hull, John Rose, who had driven him down evidently and was paying for him to stay in London at that time.
And what were your first impressions of Stuart?
Well, Stuart and John were a real laugh. I mean, a bit out there, but they were also from West Hull and from a different background to me. Both had extremely well-off families. I mean, I got on with them, that wasn't a problem. But there wasn't the same connection I shared with Paul Denman, who was from the same area as me in Hull.
And so what happened with the audition?
Well, Stuart went to an audition for a band called Arriva in Barnet, and I went along with him. And when I was in the rehearsal studios, I was asked by the manager to play the drums on one song. And this is where we first met Helen Adu, or Sade, as she's now known. And she was actually on the street waiting for us when we got off the bus. Subsequently, me and Stuart got the jobs as drummer and sax player in the band, and the band manager Lee Barrett asked me if I knew of any good bass players or any other musicians. So I took Stuart to see Paul Denman at his bedsit in Islington, and he then went and auditioned for Pride and Lee Barrett.
And Paul Denman gets the job. So now all three Hull boys are in the band, which the manager Lee Barrett then renames Pride. And this is where your connection with Sade begins, I believe. Firstly, though, tell me about Lee Barrett and what he was trying to create.
Lee managed Arriva, which he had now renamed Pride when the Hull boys joined. He'd known most of the band at his school in the Barnet area in London for a very long time, and he was an interesting character. And everyone in the band Pride kind of looked up to him. He'd lived in New York for about a year, and when he was only 20, and he came back with all these ideas of how he wanted the band to sound, like based on his experiences in New York. Everyone listened to him and thought he was a really cool character, and he did a really good job bringing everyone together. He was a good manager in that respect.
What was Sade's part in the band, and what were your impressions of her at this time?
I didn't really take much notice of her at the time. She was one of the backing singers, one of the side players in Pride. Ray St. John was the main musician of the band and songwriter, and there was singer Nick Moxham and obviously the manager Lee Barrett. These were the main guys and leaders of the band.
So what happened to the original Arriva drummer and bass player?
Well, I think Lee just said they could get lost, and we're going to run with the Northern guys in the band Pride, as he wanted a harder edge to Pride.
What do you think the difference was between them and you guys?
I just think it was down to that Northern grit. We tended to play our instruments harder. I definitely hit my drums harder than him. There was always a harder edge to musicians in the North. Bands like Joy Division, New Order. Myself and Paul had been into a band called A Certain Ratio at the time, and just loved to rock out compared to Southern musicians who didn't have the same influences in London as Northern musicians did. They might have heard The Clash or Sex Pistols, but generally London had a more cosmopolitan vibe compared to the North. There is that old joke about latte drinking Southerners, and I think it was just that. And with Lee's experiences in New York, he wanted a harder feel to the band, and we provided it in every way.
And how did the band work together on the songs?
The process of writing the music was Ray St. John would bring in lyrics and strum his song on a guitar, and the rest of the band, me, Stuart and Paul, would jam to this and create a song together. I mean, our joining the band allowed the development of new ideas around the grooves within the music, due to mine and Paul's close association as a bass and drum team that worked well together. I mean, everyone picked up on this and started to develop the Pride sound around us.
I'm now back in London, and I'm here in Soho to see what has become of some of the places that appear in our story. Soho's had a bit of a clean-up since the 1980s, but as you can probably hear, it's still as lively as ever. And there's also a fire station very close by. Firstly, I'm here on Greek Street, where back in the 1980s there was a club called Le Beetroot. It had an arched canopy over the door, and still has one actually, a little tidier, a little cleaner. Nice hair salon next door. But let's hear what Paul remembers of this place.
One time we arrived on the back of a lorry after a sound check on Hampstead Heath at midnight and performed one song outside Le Beat Route at about 3 in the morning. And then the police came along and stopped us. Boy George was there watching us, and along with people like Marilyn, another character in London at the time.
And I'm now heading down Frith Street, which has two legendary locations, Bar Italia and Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club. Firstly, Bar Italia. This is a coffee shop, which I believe was opened in 1949, and it really hasn't changed much since that time. And to say anyone has enjoyed a cappuccino in this place, and the walls are packed with the photos to prove it. And an interesting fact for you, going back to 1926, and don't worry, we won't be going back any further than this in this story. John Logie Baird gave the first public demonstration of television in this building. I suppose we could call this our Top of the Pops connection. And across the street from Bar Italia is Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club, which moved to this location in 1965. There are far too many stories to tell about this place, so let's stick with this one. This was the last venue that Jimi Hendrix played. And let's get Paul to bring us up to the 1980s.
Well, I think when you're playing Ronnie Scott's, you're literally in the centre of what's ever happening in the music industry. It's an iconic venue. It's an iconic gig to play as a band. So I think being good at Ronnie Scott's and the word getting out impresses everybody. Because you can't get a better venue to play in. We also played in Heaven, which was kind of at the time the premier sort of gay venue at the time, which was also very influential in the music scene. And obviously that crowd took to us. And also the Dirt Box, which was another level of clubbers who started taking over warehouse premises and setting DJs up in a kind of ad hoc way. So this was a precursor to the later rave and DJ club scene, which started from the early warehouse scene in London at the time. All great venues, all different audiences, but we managed to traverse a lot of them and impressed a lot of them.
And with Pride, you very quickly became popular in the underground club scene. I've got a couple of reviews here. First one's by Paul Simper, who's at the Moonlight Club. He says the drumming is tight, the sax playing impressive. Also, Jim Reed here again at the Moonlight Club. Not sure it's the same night, but he says they're sharp, attractive, and hit all the right notes. Pretty soon you're going to be hearing from them. That all sounds pretty impressive. And by this point, you'd given up your 9-to-5 job to concentrate on music full time. And you were also, along with Stuart Matthewman and Paul Denman, in a band known as PSP. That's Paul, Stuart, and Paul. Tell me how this band started and what it was all about.
Well, Pride had one band, predominantly PSP. I mean, as you've quite rightly said, Paul, Stuart, and Paul. And that band just introduced side projects with the other singers in Pride. So, for example, I mean, PSP would put a live jazz set together after Stuart approached me to do that, and we'd go and play jazz gigs. We'd play covers at places like the Hope and Anchor in Islington and the early Fridge Club in Brixton. And Stuart would lead it on the sax. We were getting good reactions from club audiences.
And how did this work itself into the Sade band setup?
Well, I think Sade saw the potential with PSP, and she was ambitious. I think she saw the fact that she could become a lead singer on her own right. And so Sade started doing gigs with us, PSP, which were even more popular than Pride. With some of the songs like Snakebite in PSP eventually finding its way onto her Diamond Life album in '84.
So with this breakaway band, were you all still performing as Pride as well?
Well, at first, Sade's show and PSP ran side by side in the Pride show, but as PSP and Sade, we got more attention. So finally, Lee Barrett held a meeting with PSP in Sade's squat in Haringey and asked us if we would be interested in forming a band with a singer called Sade, you know, with Helen Adu.
That must have been an interesting meeting. Did you all think this was a good move and the way forward?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it made sense. I mean, you know, the reaction to Sade from everybody in the club scene and the media and the PSP shows, it just seemed right. You know, that we were a lot better than Pride.
And how did the band Sade work together?
Yeah, the band Sade worked in the same way as Pride, really. I mean, apart from Stuart Matthew would then start to bring in melodies that were sung by Sade, that she'd put onto a dictaphone, and then she'd write lyrics down and bring them into the studio that she'd written in a flat with Stuart. And the band would just jam out around those themes to get the polished version, to get the live polished version going. This was all done at Solid Light Studios in Camden, and everyone would just listen and suggest things to each other as we went along. I mean, we felt with the band that we were getting a really good sound together, and we were really happy with everything we produced.
And in part 2, we catch up with Paul as the band Sade begins its ascendancy. And Paul has a bit of a bizarre meeting with band manager Lee Barrett. Just a Drummer was written, edited, produced and presented by me, Douglas Pye. Music by Paul Cook, with Paul playing premier drums as used on Diamond Life. And sound mixed by Guilt Free Studios. This was a Cook Pye production.